Hello friends, welcome to my channel. Welcome to Dev with Excel. All right, so welcome to the part 2 of Full Stack Open. In our previous video, we were able to conclude the exercises on part 1, which I believe we did successfully. So here in part 2, we will be working with course information, right? So for now, we are working with course information. That's exercise 2.1, step 6. Now the instruction here says, let's finish the code for rendering course content from exercises 1.1 to 1.5. You can start with the code from the model answers. The model answers for part 1 can be found by going to the submission system, clicking on my submissions at the top, and in the row corresponding to part 1 under the solutions column, clicking on show. To see the solution to the course info exercise, click on index.js under course info. All right, so here is what we are expected to do. Following these steps, we are expected to arrive at a page that looks like this. Then when we click on index.js, we are expected to have this. But if we look at this variable, this is not index.js, this is app.js. So the moment I click on this part, I got this. Index.js, I think it previously contained everything in app.js and index.js itself. But I think the codes were later separated into app.js and index.js. So for now, what you need is not to click on index.js, but rather to click on app.js to get this code structure. So I'm simply going to copy this, copied, and then let's go back to the instruction. All right, so we are going to be working with that code, right? So the reason why we are asked to copy that code is because, okay, yeah, so we solved that in part 1, but there's a likelihood that the structure we solved with might be a bit different from what is presented, and Full Stack Open wants us to work with this code structure given to us, right? So that doesn't mean what you solved in part 1 was wrong, but they just want this structure for us to work with. And also, if you are not able to get the steps right, you can just get to their GitHub page that contains the solutions to this, to the part 1, and then try to clone what you have there to get that code, that piece of code. All right, so going into the code implementation, as you can see, this is part 2, and I've been able to create a folder for the code setup for step 6. Now, this is named step 6 because in part 1, course info stopped at step 5, and currently we are working with course info in this part 2 at the moment. So that's why here we are having step 6 instead of starting with step 1. So this is assumed to be a continuation of the course info in step 1. All right, so I'm going to go to the SRC folder and then click on app.jsx. All right, so here is what we had in my code implementation. Yes, for part 1, here is what I had, but I think we are supposed to copy what we have in that code here. So I'm simply going to take out everything here and then replace it with what I copied here. All right. So this is done. I save the code. So the next thing we want to do is we want to run this code. So I'm simply going to copy this part for step 6 and cd into it. Then let's run it. All right, so here we can see that this is what we have currently for this exercise, right? But the instruction says, going back to the instruction 2.1, we are expected to copy or to change the app components, right? Because here in the code we have here, we can see that here we have course as a string on its own. Part is an array, right? But here course is an object that contains the course name and the likes. So we are supposed to change the app components from what it is here to what it is here. So let's just come here and then click on all of these parts here, and then we paste it here. Okay, so we save, and let's see if that is properly rendered on the screen. No, it's not properly rendered on the browser. So we are expected to work on this. Okay, so the next thing we should read is define a component responsible for formatting a single course called course. So this course here is the component we should have in our code here, which we currently don't have, right? The component structure of the application can be, for example, the following. Hence, the course component contains the components defined in the previous part, which are responsible for rendering the course name and its parts. The rendered pages can, for example, look like this. Okay, so we currently don't need to calculate for the sum of exercises yet. The application must work regardless of the number of parts a course has. So make sure the application works if you add or remove parts of a course. Ensure that the console shows no error. All right, so let's head into the code implementation. So we've been able to copy all the necessary code snippets we need to copy, and also now we need to refactor our code such that it runs and then the output looks some way like this. All right, so let's go to our browser and then let's begin with our code implementation. So I'm simply going to minimize this and this. All right, so the first thing we need to do is we need to create a component called course. Let's come here. So we say const course equals this, right? Now, this is expected to return some things, right? So, const course is expected to return the header, the total. So, we got this also from the code example we got from the model answers, right? So, we got this too, right? So, the next thing we want to do is we need to return the header and also the content. So following what we've been doing earlier, we are going to use the return statement. And also we need to understand that this course needs to take in a parameter, and in this case it's expected to take in a props. So here now we destructure the props right away. We don't need to write the keyword props, or rather we don't need to write the word props. So here we can just call the props here course. Then the next thing we need to do is let's see how we can format header into this course. So using a div, let's write header and then let's close header. Let's save. Now we are not expected to have header rendered on our browser just yet because there are still a lot of things to do. Now in our header, we can see that we have course here as our props, which returns course, right, as a value. That means that here what we need to do is we need to say course, which is of course a props here, it's a property here, is equal to Now, what do we need to return? We need to return this string here. And this string is assigned to a variable name called name. And this name is also it's a property in the object course. So this is more like a key in the course variable. So this course is a variable that holds this entire object. So to be able to access name, we need to access course before we access name. That simply means course.name. So here we are simply going to write course.name, right? So this solves it for the header. And of course, I am not too sure if this can be displayed on the browser right now. Let us try and see. Okay, all right, so that works. So right now, we've been able to sort out the header component, right, which is formatted in the course component. The next thing we need to do is we need to work on the content. Looking at this content is also a component that formats the part component as well. So let's be very sure of what we have in the part component first. Then thereafter we work on the content component. So for the part component, we have parts here as the property, and also it's returning the part name and the exercises. Now, if you look at this very well, this is name, right? Which this name, exercise, and ID, they are objects inside this array parts, right? In fact, this is the first object we have. This is the second, and it goes on that way. So to access name here, it has to be parts.name. And before part.name, it has to be course.part.name. Now, that's where these parts come into play. We call our props parts, and then we say part.name, part.exercise. Now, let's leave that here for now, and let's move into the content component. Now, this might get a little bit confusing actually, but I believe that if we take it slowly, we should be able to get it right. In this content component, what we need to work with, we need to work with the parts component. We need to format the part component. So let's simply just take out this. In short, let's take out this whole part away, and let's use div. Okay, so return. So let's use div. Why is this div not okay? So let's just write it out ourselves. All right, so we have a div, and we are using this to format the part component. Therefore, we say parts and something like this. But it doesn't end here, right? The next thing we need to do is we need to understand that part here has its property called parts. So this becomes part equals, now what's the value for this part? What value is it going to return? Currently, we can't really tell the value it's going to return. But what we can do here is we need to iterate through all the parts we have here. So one way we can do that is using the map function. So let's just leave this one here for now. Let's take it out, and then let's use the map function to work this out. So the reason why we are going to be using the map now is we want the application to be scalable. We are not going to be working as if we have just this data here. We are going to be working with the mind of perhaps we might have more than this data eventually in our code, right? What if we have more than this in the nearest for future? We need to provide some scalability on that, right? So now the next we need to do is we need to map through the parts component. So how can we do that? We use the curly brace, then we say parts dot. Now where are we getting parts from? From this property here. And then we say parts dot map. Now for this map here, we are going to is going to accept a function, right? So we are going to be doing something like this. We are expected to do something like this. So here, what we want to pass in here is parts, and then we can also do something like this. We can just choose to remove this curly brace and then use the round brackets. So using the round bracket, instead of it, we are going to call, or rather, we are going to format the parts component. So this is going to be something like this. Then we understand that this part component, it has the part property. So it's going to be parts equals. Now, the value we need to put in here is the value we passed in this function here. So this part is going to be equal to this part here. So we simply write parts. Okay. Now we need to also understand that there's a need to use a key, because if you study the material very well, we get to understand the use of a key, right? Now, when a component is re-rendered, it generates a view. So the key attribute here, which is the key we are going to be using next, it helps in updating this view, right? So it's very important we use a key. And to use a key, we are going to be using the ID values of the course object. So here we are going to be saying key is equal to course.id. So in this case now, rather path.id. So in this case now, key is referencing this path.id, right? So we have our key equals path.id, while path is equal to path. Now this might look very, very confusing, but I believe that if we take a closer look at this, it should make sense eventually. Now we have contents here. Is declared, but it's not yet used. So how do we use this content now? We need to place it inside the course component. Let's see if that works. So writing the content keyword, you should be having something like this. But now here, content here has the part property. So we are going to be saying parts equals. Now we need to set parts to be equal to something. Part is supposed to be equal to course.parts. Course.parts. Now, let me explain this parts. Now, parts here is this property we have for in contents in the content component. And the result which it's supposed to give is course.parts. Where do we have course.parts? We have course.parts here. Course.parts. And this gives us the content. All right, so let's save this and see if we get that on the browser. Oh, okay. So that's exactly what we have on the browser here. So we can see that we have fundamentals of React, using props to pass data, state of a component, and the likes. So I believe with this, we've been able to solve exercise 2.1. But to be very sure, let's go back to the instruction to see what we are being asked to do. Okay. So it says define a component responsible for formatting a single course called course. So here we can see that we have a single property called course that formats every other component. And that's why here we return only course and yet everything works out fine. Okay, so they also talked about the component structure of the application to be something like this. Yes. And also, we are asked not to calculate or to solve for the sums of exercises yet. All right, so I believe with this, we've been able to successfully solve exercise 2.1 and I believe this runs very well just as it is seen here. Okay, all right, so with this, I'll say thank you for joining on today's video and see you in the next video. Bye.